Okay, let's get started. My name is Francesco Di Lillo. I'm representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the European institutions here in Brussels. And today I'm wearing my hat as a member of the Board of Coordinators of the European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discrimination, or EPRID, that is hosting this event. EPRID, together with friends, experts, and partner organizations, hosted two informal roundtables focusing on specific themes as the role of civil society in promoting and protecting the right to freedom of religion or belief, challenges and opportunities for implementation of the EU guidelines on the protection and promotion of freedom of religion or belief, which were adopted 10 years ago. So as part of the celebration of this 10th year anniversary over the past 2 weeks, we have been engaging in conversations with experts, academia, and representatives of civil society who have been involved at various stages with the definition, study, or implementation of the EU guidelines. This is the concluding episode of our short series of conversations, and we are happy to host Arie de Pater, Brussels representative of the European Evangelical Alliance. Welcome, Arie.
Thank you.
So we will proceed with our conversations with Arie, and we invite you to use the Q&A tool that you can see on your Zoom client to submit your questions. Feel free to submit questions at any time, so that by the time that we open for your questions, there will be already some available. Also, we will add some information and background information on the chat for your convenience. Well, Arie, let's begin. And maybe you can introduce a little bit of yourself, but I have a first question for you is, when we talk about the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief, what are we talking about, and why should we take the time to celebrate their 10th anniversary?
Well, the EU guidelines are an important and official document from the European Union, reaffirming their commitment to freedom of religion or belief, which is important in and of itself. But it's also very helpful and practical, really explaining what freedom of religion or belief is. It provides political guidance for member states and for permanent missions, and possible actions. And I think these are really important because it lays down that commitment. It gives a quick overview of what is possible, what are possible responses when freedom of religion or belief is violated somewhere in the world. And then there's this commitment to training to make sure that everybody working for the European Union, either in the headquarters or either in Brussels or at the permanent missions, has a good understanding of what freedom of religion or belief is. And I think as such, it is an important guide for everybody involved. So it's really justified to celebrate that, because it's after 10 years, it still stands.
Thank you, Arie. So at the time of the adoption, civil society was quite eager to contribute. And can you share your role or involvement of your organizations in the drafting process of the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief? And in your opinion, how open were the institutions to the feedback from civil society?
Well, at that time, I was advocacy director of Open Doors International, and my colleague Esther Kattenberg was representative in Brussels. So she was directly involved in the whole process. So for most of the time, I've been just a supporter and advisor in the background. But I recall that I attended at least one session in Brussels, a roundtable that was called together by Mr. Boulvin, and I was really impressed by the openness of the European Union, of Mr. Boulvin, to work with civil society, and for me, the whole process, you saw all experts, the EPRID people, but also some friends close to EPRID, FORB experts, who are really willing to sacrifice quite a bit of time and to share their expertise and the European Union was really willing to take that the expertise of civil society on board while drafting the EU guidelines. I think collectively as civil society, we have a lot of experience. We know the situation on the ground from all the testimonies that we've heard. And I think that was really helpful and appreciated by the European Union in the whole drafting process. You're muted, Francesco.
Thank you. And were there any lessons learned or insights gained from the drafting process that you believe are important to consider for future initiatives related to freedom of religion or belief?
Well, as I already said, I was impressed by the unity of civil society. They were really coming together, sharing their expertise. So it's the unity and cooperative spirit of civil society. I think that was one of the key factors. The quality of the submissions. I inherited a directory, an EPRID directory from my predecessor, Kristen Ngambi, who was on behalf of the European Evangelical Alliance involved in the process. And I was really impressed. I haven't read everything, but there are quite a few impressive documents with input from civil society for the EU guidelines. So I think the unity, cooperative spirit, and the quality of the submission, I think that was all key. And then the role of Mr. Bovin, I think John Kinnan already referred to that as well in our first conversation in this series. But yeah, he was really open. He was really appreciating and welcoming the input of civil society and willing to take our comments and expertise on board. So I think that level of trust that you also build by your unity, by your cooperative spirit, by the quality of your submissions, I think that trust is always key for any advocacy effort in Brussels and elsewhere for that matter. So yes, I think these were the key lessons that I learned, or that I saw reconfirmed by this whole drafting process.
Thank you. And as we look 10 years later, how do you perceive the impact of these guidelines since their adoption? Have there been any notable success or challenges in their implementation or enforcement?
Well, I've been really struggling with, because over the last few weeks, as you said, we had several sessions also as EPRID to evaluate the impact of the guidelines. And it's quite difficult to really assess the impact of the guidelines, as it is usually with any policy. What is the real impact? There hasn't been any formal evaluation as far as I'm aware. We had a report from Professor Fleuret 3 years in, but that's all I'm aware of. And quite a few of the activities related to the policies usually take place behind the scenes. So not all information is available to make a comprehensive evaluation of the guidelines. I've seen several successes or serious involvement of the EU in various fault violations around the world. So that the EU has been active, but I don't think that we've seen even half of it. So that is in the permanent missions of the EU and also in the embassies of member states in the field. What I have seen, and that's closer to home, and especially in Brussels, is that over the years I've met with several very committed people in the EAS, in the Commission, in the Council, who really are concerned about freedom of religion and belief. They really care. They do their utmost to get involved. So I think that was encouraging. And there's also a commitment in the guidelines for training. And as EPRID, we have been involved in several of these training sessions. So they took the training commitment seriously. And at least annually, when they had people from the permanent missions together in Brussels, there have been training sessions dedicated to freedom of religion or belief. And we've been involved as EPRID as well. And that was really helpful for, I think, for both. Again, our practical experience with FOLP on the ground was helpful for the diplomats who were at the training, but also for us to meet with these EU officials working on the topic. That was quite encouraging as well, to see how they their interest, their willingness to learn and to take our experience to heart. I think that was at least some success of the. You can ascribe that to the guidelines. So yeah, there has been an impact, but how big the impact really was on the ground is hard to assess, I think, from a distance.
Thank you. And you mentioned training, right? Just now, training of EU officials. In your experience, as you took part of this training, what, in your opinion, would be the areas that are most needed for EU officials or diplomats or those in the EU delegations abroad to be trained on?
The role of religion or faith or belief, for that matter, in for any individual. Too often, I think, and especially in Europe, where freedom of religion or belief is somewhat of a given in most parts of on the continent, we don't realize how important and what the impact of freedom of religion or belief really is in your daily life. So I think these examples where how important it is, how important certain religious practices are, how important certain places are for faith or belief communities. I think these are things that if you're not familiar with a particular religion, you might not realize how important that is. So I think these are the very practical things, because sometimes people don't really understand why you cling to certain place, or why you cling to a certain habit, or why is halal food so important, or why is a kippah so important for you? That is hard to understand if you're not an adherent to that particular religion. And I think it's that kind of practical experience that would really help to have a better understanding of the importance of freedom of religion or belief.
So not just the actual policies or international laws or instruments, but it's important to expand also on the religious and cultural aspects of individual religious beliefs.
Yeah, because I think in theory, most EU officials, if not all, will know that there is something like freedom of religion or belief, that people should be free to have a religion, to change and to manifest their religion. But what it really means in practice, I think that is something that you only know from own experience. And because freedom of religion or belief also is important for people with no religion or belief, you don't necessarily realize that you are free not to believe, not to go to a church or a mosque in your society, is also included and protected by freedom of religion or belief. So if you are a non-religious person, to put it bluntly, then you might not realize how important it is for yourself as well, because you feel like, okay, well, freedom of religion or belief, well, that's not me. But I think that the more practical and lived experience of people with faith or non-faith in a society where there is no freedom of religion or belief, I think that is that's an important contribution of civil society.
Well, thank you, Arie, for bringing up also the the importance and relevance of freedom of religion or belief also for non-believers. And this is, I think, it's an opportunity for me on behalf of EPRID to restate also the fact that the promotion of this right is not only on behalf of believers, but is also on behalf of non-believers. And this is an important aspect that sometimes is overlooked and misunderstood. So thank you for reminding that. So before I come to the last question I have for you, let me remind our participants to this could be a good time to submit your questions, if any, on in the Q&A box, and so that we can have them submitted to shared to our friend Arie. Okay, so my last question is for you. So during our conversations that we had before, and I remind we had one with John Kinahan, Professor Anikino, and Dr. Andrea Benzo. Some suggested that there is an opportunity to revise the guidelines to adapt them to the changing nature of the freedom of religion and belief landscape. So have there been any developments or changes in this field that, in your opinion, since the drafting of the guidelines, should be taken into account for future revisions or updates of the guidelines?
Well, I think, as is the case in the international realm on FOB more in general, we don't necessarily need more documents. We need the implementation of existing documents. I think that would be an important start. Well, of course, in preparation of this webinar, I went through the guidelines again, and I was actually quite impressed about the quality of the guidelines. So I don't think that we necessarily need a full revision of the guidelines. And when you do so, it's also good to kind of consider the costs. So what do we really? Are we really convinced that they will get any better, better than what we already have? I think there's one omission, one thing that 10 years ago wasn't as prevalent as it is now. That's technical surveillance. I think that there is something about freedom of expression online and offline, which is important, but there's nothing, no reference to biometric remote identification of people like we see nowadays in China, for example, where face recognition is almost everywhere, and people can easily be identified just when walking on the street or walking through a red light or whatever. So well, that is something that is not that much in the guidelines yet. But you can include that in the guideline, in the training as well. You don't need a full revision. And when I think if we can, I think we should start with re-emphasizing the importance of FOB in the whole context of human rights and the importance of the guidelines. If people take the implementation seriously, I don't think that we need a revision of the guidelines at this moment.
And I might follow up with one of the questions that one question Rachel Forster just submitted, and I don't know if you have answered to it in a way, but she says, do you see room for improvement in the guidelines or in their implementation, or how could civil society support the EU on this? So in general terms, you kind of already responded to this question, but I don't know if you see any additional room for improvement and how civil society can support the EU.
Yeah, well, can we support the EU? Of course, with quality information. If you come across any incident, any violation, whether either structural or with an individual involved somewhere, it's important to share that information, well documented, of course. But I think what I regret to a certain extent, when I was with Open Doors and the guidelines were published, I did 1 or 2 training sessions on the ground that included a more general overview of human rights and the role of freedom of religion or belief. And I've been wondering whether we've done enough as civil society to inform people on the ground on the guidelines, because if to a certain extent it's a protection for them, and they could get in touch with the permanent mission of the EU in that country, if that's safe, of course, and refer to the guidelines and say, well, this has happened, can I share that with you, and what is it that you could do to support me or my case. So I think we could have, as civil society, we could have done more, and it's not too late. The guidelines are still there, so we can still use them to inform our contacts on the ground. And I know that Rachel is involved in several projects in various countries where freedom of religion or belief is not a given. So maybe that could be part of that program. So.
Thank you. There is another question from Katya Lane, and this was mentioned, but perhaps a bit more in detail. How can we foster a deeper understanding and appreciation of freedom of religion or belief among individuals who do not adhere to any particular faith or belief system?
Well, I think work together, speak up if something happens, so tell the story, and not just for your own people, but support others as well. Several organizations have good reports on freedom of religion or belief in any particular country or around the world. There's the Freedom of Thought report from the Humanists. There is the watch list of Open Doors. The EP Intergroup has a report. Aid to the Church in Need have a report. So from various faith groups and non-faith groups, there are good reports. And I think these stories will help people to connect and to relate to the stories. Because for me, every story of an individual who's been harassed or whose right to freedom of religion or belief has been violated is also an illustration of how life would look like if we had no freedom of religion or belief. And I hope that will help people to understand the importance, not just for religious people, but for everyone.
Thank you, Arie. I do have another question from Joseph Young, asking how have the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief have been received by the majority of MEPs, other EU officials, and policymakers? Are they used frequently? If not, how can the guidelines be re-emphasized to these officials?
Well, it's always good, like we are doing now, is to highlight the EU guidelines and to share about the importance of it. So we can still do that with EU officials, either in the permanent missions or in Brussels. We can use that in our conversations with MEPs on freedom of religion or belief. So I think much is on us as civil society to highlight the EU guidelines. How they've been involved? Well, there is an EP intergroup in the Parliament, and I wasn't really impressed by the number of MEPs involved in the EP intergroup. It's just a very tiny section of all 700 MEPs, so that wasn't really encouraging, I think. But if something really happens in several of the reports, the more general human rights and democracy reports, there are references to freedom of religion or belief as a human right. So yes, there's always room for improvement, and it's mainly on us, I think.
Thank you, Arie. There's another question from Jean Bingham. How are the EU guidelines on FORB be spread to other parts of the world? I assume maybe this could be, how can they be more effectively promoted in other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, that is, I think, back to the question of Rachel at the beginning, or the first question. as civil society, we could bring it to the attention of our contacts on the ground. So if we have projects in any of the countries where freedom of religion or belief is not a given, you can share the EU guidelines and say, well, this is guidance for the permanent mission in your country, or of any of the embassies of the member states for that matter, and you can bring that to their attention. So that's one thing. If you mean, or if the question is whether there's anything similar to the EU guidelines in any of the other parts of the world, I'm not quite sure. I know that the United Kingdom has a toolkit on freedom of religion or belief, but I don't have a clear overview of any other parts of the world, whether there's something similar to the EU guidelines.
Thank you. I do see two remaining questions on the Q&A, but I think I don't know whether they would be. I can share them with you as an EPRID member. What are your predictions for the development and impact of EPRID over the next 10 years?
What are predictions? Well, I like the answer of Professor Anekino when he was also asked about predictions, and he said, "Well, I'm not that good at that." I can share a little about my hope for EPRID, if that's okay, rather than to give a prediction. I would really hope that EPRID would grow and really have a solid representation of all civil society and all faith or non-faith groups coming together with a commitment to freedom of religion or belief. For me, the conversations we've had over the years in EPRID, coming from various backgrounds, were really helpful. It was really informative to learn more about certain faith or belief communities in a country that I wasn't aware of. So it's that aspect of EPRID that I really appreciate, and I hope that many other organizations and many other faith or belief communities will join EPRID, because together we are definitely stronger. And I emphasize that it's not just faith groups, but also belief groups. So in 10 years' time, if we could have double the number of members or even triple, whatever, you're all welcome. And I really appreciate these conversations and the expertise of so many practitioners coming together on a really informal platform. So that's not necessarily a prediction, but that's definitely my hope for EPRID.
Well, I think it's a shared hope for that, Arie. Let me ask you another question, and this could be the last one, unless something else pops up on the Q&A. It has to do with revisions or improvements of the EU guidelines. And so in 2013, when the guidelines were not, where the guidelines were adopted, we did not have at that time the EU special envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion outside of the EU. So my question is, well, kind of two questions. One is, what is the role that you see for the EU Commission special envoy within the framework of the EU guidelines? And the second question would be, wouldn't that be something to consider to actually finally institutionalize this appointment, this mandate, and have it included as part of the EU guidelines on freedom of religion and belief?
For me, the important role of the special envoy is adding some visibility to freedom of religion or belief and the EU's commitment. So for me, the EU guidelines and the special envoy are are both important indicators that the EU takes freedom of religion or belief seriously. And the guidelines are for the whole of the EU, the whole of the system, which includes the special envoy. And you're right, there's no specific reference to the EU special envoy for the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the EU in the guidelines. And at the same time, there is this clear commitment. Well, you could add something like, okay, the country, it's important for the special envoy to visit a country when something, when there's really a serious issue there. So yes, we could do that, and at the same time, I trust that the special envoy will do that anyways. If we as civil society can maintain that open conversation with the special envoy and his office, I trust he will do so, and he will take our information seriously. So yeah, as you I think you feel already, I'm still a little bit hesitant to renegotiate the EU guidelines. But yes, to have a more permanent position of a special envoy with a more solid mandate and a more solid office, more capacity, I think that would be appreciated. But it's not just the EU special envoy. I think we need the whole EU system to take human rights seriously. We have Eamon Gilmore as the special representative for human rights more in general. We have also the more kind of economic and trade documents and delegations in the European Union. And for me, human rights, and including freedom of religion or belief, should be an integral part of that whole EU engagement with the outside world. So yes, we have a special envoy, and I think that is important to build trust, to show that we take, as EU, we take freedom of religion or belief seriously. But whether that's a reason to renegotiate the guidelines, I'm still not totally convinced.
Well, thank you so much, Arie, for your time, for your insights, for sharing your experiences, and many thanks to our participants who joined online from many parts of the world. Well, this concludes our series of conversations that EPRID hosted as part of our initiative to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the EU guidelines on the promotion and protection of freedom of religion or belief. We will conclude this initiative on Monday with an event in Brussels featuring, among others, the European Commission Special Envoy for Freedom of Religion or Belief, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, along with other experts from the EU and civil society. More information can be found on our Twitter profile at EPRID4Forb, that you can see also in the chat. This said, thank you again for joining, and we wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for moderating, Francesco, and thank you all for listening.